Right, Morris. Stu's been working away on this. I think he'd just started work on the final wing, the near side rear wing, last week. He has carried on with that. He's got 80% of the shape there. We weren't happy with the arch lip. It just wasn't quite right. And we got to the point, and anybody that does metal shaping will have been in this situation, where you can chase your tail, go round and round in circles, trying to fine-tune part of a panel that you've made after welding it all together, and actually what happens is you ruin the entire panel. So we've elected to not do that. We had a chat with Stu and we've had a bit of a think about it and decided to remake the lip as a separate section, which is done. Happy with the fit of that now. It's all sat on there with no real tension on it. He's tacked that all on now just to verify that it's exactly right and all flush. He's going to scribe and cut that in next, get that cut in. And then that should then finalise this wing. We were really happy with the rest of it, so we didn't want to fiddle too much with the rest of it, and trying to manipulate the lip to get the shape correct there was starting to pull the rest of the shape around. I mean, it's not a thing you want to do. It's best to cut your losses, cut out the section that you're not happy with and make a new section, and don't be afraid to put another weld into the panel. It's always nice to make a panel with as few welds as possible, but not at the expense of misshaping the rest of the panel because of that. So he'll get that cut in probably tomorrow, I think now, and then at that point that will be great. And that leads me neatly on to this, which Cal mentioned last week, which is a toy I bought myself a few months ago, actually about 4 or 5 months ago. Bought myself this Senga planishing hammer. I'd always wanted one. There are various American versions which are very popular in the States, but they're very hard to get hold of in the UK. These Senga ones were one of the few that were made in the UK, and it's actually a really good tool, and it's so useful for this sort of work because this wing, it's very nice to be able to planish it on the car. Once this weld seam is done all the way around here, you have to planish a weld seam. Again, I'm probably teaching people to suck eggs here, but whenever you create a weld on a panel, you are depositing metal at a temperature, say 1400 degrees C, somewhere around there. When you deposit a piece of steel at 1400 degrees C, as it cools, it gets smaller. There's nothing you can do about that. There's all sorts of black magic and wizardry and stuff that people talk about doing various things to weld seams to magically make them not distort. Well, they always distort. There's no magic around that. It always does. You deposit metal at 1400 degrees, it's going to get smaller as it gets colder. What you do though is you deposit that metal and you deposit a slight excess of metal, so you've got a raised section, then you hammer it against a dolly which stretches it and takes it back and changes the length back to the length it was. So when Stu goes all the way around, he'll cut that in, he'll tack it at inch intervals, and after each tack he'll tap the tack up onto a dolly, stretch it back, which will get the length of the material back. Then he'll do the next tack. You never do the next tack till you've tapped the previous one up, because otherwise it'll pull the panel together and you'll lose your gap as you go around. So he'll tap all the tacks up as he goes round. Once they're all done and the panel's all aligned, he'll then go round it and he'll just TIG weld it all in one, all the way around, non-stop. None of this, people talk about doing bits of weld and spreading the heat. It doesn't work, forget that. You just weld it all the way around. Once it's welded, you allow it to cool, then it'll be distorted. That will have shrunk and pulled that wing. And that's where you come in with this. And he'll then go round with this planishing hammer and basically hammer that weld seam all the way around. I'm not going to put it in the wing now, but you'll go around with that, and this little head oscillates in here. It's air powered, and you pick the correct crown of dolly to get in there, which probably will be this one. I think this should get round that, looking at the shape. And you'll go round it with that, and that will hammer the weld seam down, stretch it back, and as you go round, you just concentrate on that weld seam, stretch it all back, and amazingly the shape will all go back to where you wanted it, as long as you do it right. Get your stretch right, then you'll stretch all that all the way around, the shape will go back to where it was, and suddenly it'll look great again. So yeah, we're really very, I was very pleased with this little toy. I've been looking for one for ages, and it came up on eBay at sensible money. I mean, relatively cheap really, considering that they fairly regularly come up in pretty poor condition and go for a fair amount of money, and that so I was very pleased to pick up on that. It was quite exciting. I'm inner child when it comes to tool toys. So yeah, really good. So yeah, as of the end of tomorrow, I think we should have 4 wings that are all then at the stage where they need attacking with the planishing hammer. Basically, that's the stage we'll be at tomorrow. First port of call would be the Morris. So Nat talked last week about
doing a weld along a panel and the planishing process to smooth that out afterwards, which was the sort of talk of the moment, because Stu was letting in a new section around here because he decided that although the original one was very close, it just wasn't quite right. So this week he's been getting those completely finished and then carried on planishing and perfecting the shape, and then he's been applying essentially a guide coat. It's used engineer's blue, but it's essentially a guide coat over there to then body file until he gets rid of any high spots, tapped up any low spots, and just continued that process until he's happy with it. And then it's just been gone over it with a quick sand with the DA sander. I think this one's done, the other one's almost there. It's probably notable from watching the progress on this over the last few weeks that it's been quite typical in terms of a sheet metalwork project like this, in terms of you appear to achieve 90% of the work very quickly, and then it's that last 10% visually, that last 10% visual change takes 90% of the time. To get it from almost right to 100% right takes so much more time than getting it from a flat sheet to most of the way there, or what seems to be most of the way there. So it can be quite deceptive, that sort of sheet metalwork task. You get really excited because you think, blimey, he's done that quick, and then the last bit drags on, but it's fairly typical. Aha, right, well, here we are at Morris. The key major piece of progress here is that Stu has, I believe now, finished, in fact, fettling the wings. It's been a slog, as this stage in any process, always in any sheet metal work always is. The final phase of getting it ready for the body man to follow on from is quite a big process. But all the wings are now tapped up and filed up. We're happy with the finish on all of that, as far as I'm aware now. We're happy with everything there. Stu's done a great job of that. And yeah, all four corners are now basically at the stage where they're ready for body work. The front end, we've revised the method of hinging of the bonnet. We're front hinging the bonnet for various reasons, but we're mounting the hinge assembly to the front tube framework. You can see one of the hinges there. Stu's done a bit of templating work and come up with a cardboard template for the shape of the hinge needed to clear the slam panel. He's also fabricated the slam panel. It leads neatly onto, which is a nice pressed steel item with pressed swaged holes in it, just to keep the weight down and make it look visually appealing. That will also mount the top of the radiator. But then the hinges have to go around that to enable the bonnet to hinge up and clear that. So Stu's done a little profile. We've drawn that on CAD and CNC cut those. So now we've got to weld some bosses on to mount that, and we're going to do some little bronze bushes for the bonnet hinges to rotate on. So he's currently working on putting the steel work into the front corners of the bonnet to mount off the flanges in these corners to pick the hinges up. And then we've got to work on the latching mechanism at the back, which we're thinking, the thinking currently is pit pins on that, but that's the next phase. First phase is getting the hinge assemblies right. We wanted to make sure we've got the wings completely finalised before moving on to that, because we've got to set the exact shut lines on the bonnet. We're pretty happy with where all that's at now. So really the next phase on this is going to be taking it off the jig, which at the moment the plan is Monday. This should be coming off the jig. So yeah, that'll be really. All of us are greatly looking forward to seeing this on its wheels. The cars look so different when they're on the jig to when they're on their wheels. We're really looking forward to that situation. So that'll be yeah, next week all will be revealed. So yeah, so that's where we're at on the Morris. It seems like there's loads of really cool stuff this week, actually. The Morris, which is finally off the jig, obviously making way for the secret project over there. This is the stage we were all super excited to get to, and it didn't disappoint really. You know, it was just fantastic. You see a car at that height for so long, you sort of forget how small a car they are. And you're just really looking forward to seeing it at its kind of final stance, just to
see the overall look, and it's more of a glimpse into the finished product, even though it's, you know, it's nothing like the finished product in terms of the paint, and even the wheels aren't the ones we're going to use. It's just a nice hint of that end result, which keeps you fired up about it. So the last bits we did on the jig, Stu was working on the bonnet. I think we just showed last week that he was just doing some trial hinges on the front to make sure we could get the opening as we wanted it. That worked really well. We'll obviously machine those hinges in alley now to make a nice job of them. But the structure on the inside of the bonnet, he's finished all of that, the structure where they mount onto the bonnet itself. And he wanted to get that done so he could get all of that structure complete there, which was really the last of the, what's the word? The structural parts. Struggling for my words here, but yeah, that's the last of the structural work on the front of the car, which we wanted to do with it on the jig, so we could be sure of all the alignment, and then we were happy to take it off and roll it around. And to be honest, now it probably won't go back on a jig now, it'll stay just rolling around while we do all of the rest of the metalwork on it. We'll obviously then strip it down, put it on the rotisserie to do all of the underside welds, which we've not been able to do with it on the jig. But yeah, light at the end of the tunnel on the metalwork on that. One thing I will mention actually was, it's funny that when we did, I think probably on Instagram or Facebook, some photos of it rolling and photos about the flip front, a lot of people said, oh, isn't it going to be a pain working on the engine bay or filling the fluids with the bonnet flipping that way? And even the owner passed the same comment. And I think you get deceived when a car's on the jig like that. You think you're going to be, you kind of have this vision, and also because you're mindful of more modern cars, you have this vision you're going to be draped out over the wing just to fill the brake fluid or something, and actually it's nothing like that at all. I mean, I can show you right now. It's if we flip that up, the screen wash reservoir is going to be here, and the brake fluid at the same point on the other side, and the coolant fill will just be on the side of the engine here. And in reality, it's literally like knee height, so filling the screen wash at the back of the engine bay is just a case of reaching to here. And if the bonnet was opening this way, that really would be in your way. So just a little mention of that to dispel all the criticism that was coming for having the bonnet opening that way. Morris, back on with it. It's, I was going to say everybody's favourite project. I'm sure it's not everybody's favourite project, but it's certainly one that a lot of people have been saying, when are you going to be back on with the Morris? And that time is now. I think Nat mentioned last week we did a bit of a meeting, job listing session, got it up on the ramp, went over the underside of it, and just went over the car with a fine-tooth comb listing the next round of metalwork jobs, which largely now is detail work, although some of the jobs are still fairly major, but a lot of it is to do with making provision for fuel plumbing, loom running, battery wiring, battery mounting, brake line running, clutch line running, heater ducting. It's kind of all of those details, and there's a few more major things. We've got to make the provision for the rear lights, we've got to do the design and make the hinges for the boot lid. Bonnet hinges we've done, but we've got to come up with the latching system for the bonnet. The doors, we're going to put a modern latching system and redesign the door handles. So those are some of the more major tasks involved. But where we started actually, which is what Scott's on with at the minute, was finishing this rear area of the floor here. So there were two kind of open triangles in the chassis design, which we knew we were going to make use of to mount the battery and the remote servo, but we hadn't finalised the exact detail of that metalwork yet. So Scott's been on with creating a fabricated recess to make as much use of that available space as possible, and create sort of more room inside the shell there. Then he's bracketed up the remote servo on that side, made up a really nicely fabricated battery tray this side, and then we're just in the process of working out how to do the covering panels that will go over, because we're going to have a panel each side that basically panel those areas in. They're also going to house the rear speakers, and they'll be up. We've got to make provision also for how they're going to be upholstered. So an hour ago, Scott and I had a bit of a heads together on how we might go about making those, and how we might go about upholstering them, and how all the panels are going to sit together. We've just done a quick mock-up of the quarter panel trim card here, so we could have that in place when we're designing that covering piece to make sure it all butts up nicely against that. So that's what we're on with at the minute, is basically designing those rear covering pieces there. So next week, no doubt Scott will have absolutely knocked that out the park, and he'll be wandering around blowing his own trumpet. Scott has been on with the Morris. So we were looking last week at the area, in the back seat area, shall we say. This car's not having a back seat, so that area back there we were making use of to mount the remote servo and the battery, which is now done. And last week, and that looked at the fact he was making the cover panels to go over that. And there was a little bit of thinking in so much as we didn't really want any visible fasteners on that. And we needed somewhere to put some speakers, and we realised there would be just enough room to get the depth of the speakers in above those components. So what we decided to do was make a metal frame in there that actually bolts in. That will sit under the cover panel, and then there'll be a pin at the top of the cover panel to stop the top edge of it flapping. But then the main thing holding the cover panel down will actually be those speakers. So the speakers pin the cover panel down to those brackets, and then there are bolts at the very bottom front edge, but they're fairly hidden away. And then the way the speakers fit is that you bolt them in and then the grills go in afterwards, so then they hide those bolts, so it will be attaching those cover panels there. So that's all finished now. Scott's then moved on to some of the front end, so he's been doing the radiator mounting. This is just a dummy radiator. We've used this technique quite a lot, where we just fabricate a steel frame that represents the shape of the radiator and the mounting points, so we can do all the bracketry without risking damaging an actual radiator. And then when we're done, we'll send that dummy frame off to Concept Racing, who do our aluminium radiator fabrication, and then they can use that as a model to then build a radiator around that envelope. The next things on the front here are going to be also the aircon condenser and oil cooler mount. So they've actually just arrived today, so we can do that. And we're going to have an aircon condenser sort of offset to one side here, and then a vertically mounted oil cooler the other side. Moving on from that, Scott did these infill sections of inner wing here. That was probably the last bit of the inner wing structure which we hadn't quite got around to finishing, is this fillet in here. So he's done those both sides. We've done the fuel pressure regulator mount, which is just down here mounted off the chassis under the throttle bodies. Keeps it reasonably out of sight. You can still reach it to adjust it. And that's exactly where we wanted it in terms of the pipe run. So we had a planning meeting a few weeks ago, which I think we've mentioned before, to basically plan all of the remaining metalwork jobs on the car. And that's when we get down to thinking about things like where the brake lines are going to run, where the clutch lines are going to run, where the fuel lines are going to run. So at this stage we can then put all the mounting points in for those, so we know where that fuel line plumbing is going to go, and that was taken into account when we were considering the position for that regulator. What else have we been doing on that throttle pedal? We've got a Tilton pendulum mount pedal box in this, which there was mounting provision put into the chassis for the main part of the pedal box. Now the throttle pedal mounts off the side of that, but we weren't mad keen on the distance that sits from the other pedal. It seems to sit unnecessarily far away. So we're having a bit of a rethink on that, and we also wanted to change the way the cable actuation works. The sort of off-the-shelf Tilton cable linkage pulls down, and it would be nice if the cable was pulling forwards. So rather than using the Tilton linkage, we're going to make an extension off the top of the pedal, so that it becomes basically a front pull cable on it. So Scott's just in the process of making a mounting for that throttle pedal, and then once we've done that, we're going to make an extension off the top of the pedal to convert it to front pull, and then the cable will just come through the bulkhead, just sneaking under or next to the air filter here to loop round to the linkage, which will be mounted on, I can't remember if that's going to go under the throttle bodies or on top, but basically it'll be a front entry cable onto the throttle bodies. So he's been working on that, and I think the last thing he's been working on this is the front speakers. We want some speakers mounted down in the kick panels there. We also wanted a method of mounting the actual trim panels into those kick panel areas. And there was a third factor in that, in the battery cable and wiring loom routing, which we want to bring down the sill, which is a hollow section. The battery cable will enter that sill under the cover that we talked about that covers the battery up. So you won't see that at all in the car. It runs down the inside of the sill, and then it's got to come out of the sill at the top, at the front. And it needs something to cover up where it runs up the inside of the kick panel. So all of those factors work quite well together, in that if we designed a speaker mounting that gave us enough room for the magnet on the speaker to clear the kick panel, and enough room to run the wire up the inside of that kick panel area, it meant our trim panel could sit over, have a return edge at the back and be spaced off enough to cover the wiring. And we could use the speaker to actually mount the panel exactly as we have done in the back. So Scott's made these lovely plasma cut brackets that bolt onto threaded bosses, which is welded to the inside of the kick panel. And then the trim panel will sit over that. The speaker will pin it into the bracket, so that will actually retain it, so no visible fixings on the panel itself. And then the wiring will go up behind that trim panel. So that's really worked out well in terms of a neat design there. Scott has been on with the Morris, so the thing he's on with at the moment is the aircon condenser. I've probably mentioned before that one of the challenges with this car is the amount of things we've got to package into a very small space, and the front end's no exception. We showed you before the mock-up radiator we've got in there. Scott's now done the oil cooler mounts for the engine oil cooler, and he's just working on the AC condenser mount, so that basically then takes up all of the space in front of the radiator. There'll then be an electric fan on the back of the radiator, and that pretty much takes up all the space at the front. And also, just to add even more things into that front space, one of the things we wanted to include, A, for better lighting, and B, because it was a cool feature in our original design renderings for this car, was a pair of spotlights recessed into each side of that grille at the very side area where there's not really any detriment to the airflow. So we've got a set of Sibi Mini Oscar LED spotlights, which Scott's just been fabricating the mounts for those at the front there, and that looks really cool, so happy with that. And I think Stu's also been working on the boot hinges. So we've deleted all of the external hinges that this used to have. The bonnet, as you've probably seen previously, flips forwards and is hinged at the front. The boot lid's going to open the normal way, opening up at the back, but we're going to have internal hinges, and it's just working out how they're going to work and making sure they're not going to clash with the space the fuel tank takes up. Nat had previously designed the fuel tank for this, so he's got a CAD drawing of how that's going to be. So Stu's just been referencing that drawing and making sure that the space the hinges go into when the boot lid is shut doesn't interfere with that space. But that's looking good as well. So that's the latest on that. Have a sip of my medicine again. I'll stand by the boat anchor that we've removed from the Toyota. That won't be going back in. The 4-cylinder P-Series diesel that we've... yeah, we'll put this in. Watch this space, it's going in the Morris. Yeah, no, we will. I don't know quite what's happening to it yet. That's going to depend on what the customer would like to do with it, whether he's got a customer for it or wants to try and sell it or whatever. I'm sure somebody will have it because it was a good engine. But certainly it's not going back in, so it will undoubtedly be for sale, I would think. The Morris progress this week. Stu and Scott have been working on the Morris quite a lot. Scott has done various jobs, some tricky and some quite satisfying fabrication jobs. He's done the fuel filler recess. We're using, I'm going to not be able to remember whether it's called a Monza or an Aston type fuel filler. Is it a Monza one? I think it's a Monza type fuel filler. I'll be corrected if I've got it wrong, I'm sure. The one with the catch on the side that flicks up, old Jaguar style fuel filler. Scott's fabricated a conical recess for that to sit into, very similar to what we did on Utah, so that because it's fitted to a curved panel, you have to create a flat patch for the filler to sit onto. We also needed to change the angle very slightly, and to get it sitting in the right place, it basically needed a little pad to sit into. If you do that as a parallel-sided recess, it doesn't look very pretty at all. Looks much nicer with a conical recess, and then that in turn enables there to be room for the catch to flick down to enable the filler to open. So he's rolled up and fabricated a cone, drawn it on CAD, plasma cut it out, rolled it up and then trimmed it to the curve of the rear panel, well, the upper part of the rear panel, on the rear scuttle if you like, trimmed it to that curve, made a flange also to the same curve, TIG welded the flange on, TIG welded a flange into the bottom of it that's flat to take the fuel filler, and then TIG welded the whole lot into the car, so that's all now fitted. At the front, he's been working on the aircon condenser fitment, which has proven to be a bit one of those nightmare jobs where with the spotlights and the radiator and all the other parts fitted, we've kind of boxed ourselves into a little bit of a corner with the aircon. The fittings are quite big. I believe I saw, I'm not quite sure on this, but I believe I saw Cal looking at some smaller fittings. The air conditioning condenser plus the fittings
It's quite, it was very tight in the front of the car. Could be done, it will fit, and it does now fit, but there was a bit of trial and error involved in making the brackets and getting them to fit. That's all good though. Scott's done a really nice job of fabricating it. It looks all really neat now. It was just a challenging piece of work getting the measurements right, because we were talking sort of a couple of millimetres each way for everything to be able to fit into the space, but it does now all fit. He's also machined some bosses and CNC cut some plates out to enable us to mount, because this car's having air conditioning, which we may or may not have touched on before. He's machined some bosses and cut some plates out to bolt the Ford Focus type air conditioning compressor, as would have been fitted to a Zetec originally, onto this engine. We can't use the original bracketry because it fouls the engine mount, and it will also mean that the air compressor fouls the subframe, which was an area we thought we may have an issue, and we knew we needed to address it at some point. That job's been brought up the priority list a little bit because the car's going away to Simpson Race Exhausts tomorrow. So that job needed to be brought up the priority list this week, so that we've got the air conditioning compressor in place to enable the manifold to be made to fit around it, so that it's there when Matt goes to make the exhaust manifold. So Scott's machined some bosses, welded them to the plate. We've now got the aircon compressor set up on 4 threaded rods, so we've got some adjustment. That will then, once we get the car back from Matt, we'll double check all the position, we'll get all the belt run checked. Once the belt run's confirmed as good, then we'll draw up a billet bracket to replace that temporary bracket that's on now, and we'll do a nice aluminium billet bracket. But at the moment, that's a trial bracket just to make sure the alignment's all good. He's also mounted up, modified the power steering pump bracket. Again, we're using a Focus type power steering pump setup, but that needs modifying as well because of a bolt clash on an engine mount. With the way I've done the engine mount, where the engine mounts need to sit on this car, there's not a lot of structure on the engine block, so I put an arm up from the engine mount which clashes with where the power steering pump needs to mount, so we've just had to do a slight modification so that they can both share the same bolt. I hadn't basically left it right for that to be able to fit, so we've had to, Scott's altered it now so that they can both share the same bolt, so that all fits now in the front. And what else has happened on Morris? Stu. I'll go over to Stu. Stu's been working on the boot hinges. I don't know whether there was a little hint of it in the last video. He'd started on those at the tail end of last week. He's made some very nicely shaped steel, quite delicate looking and very pretty little boot hinges, which enable the boot to open quite a long way, but tuck away out of the way underneath the rear scuttle to still keep us room for the fuel tank, which we've got to get under there. And in order to get those into place, to get everything aligned on the car, he's made a very cunning, this is a very Stu-esque little jig, which is the sort of thing I wouldn't have thought of. He made a jig which was a long pin with sleeves that then picked up off the hinge pivots with R-clips through to pin them in place at the correct width, so that he could pull the R-clips out, slide the hinges together, put them into the boot aperture, and then slide them out to the width they needed to be at, which was too wide to get through the boot aperture, then install the R-clips, which then hold those hinges at the right separation, exactly the same separation as the mounting pads on the boot lid, and then he could weld those in place with them pinned on, then pull the R-clips off, slide the jig back out again, leaving the hinges behind. Very cunning little bit of work by Stu there. He's an absolute master of that sort of thing. Very good at lateral thinking when it comes to that sort of thing. I'll just double check I haven't missed anything too obvious on that. No, I think we've got everything. Yeah, we've got everything there. That's it's really nice progress on that. So that'll be next week. That will have an exhaust manifold and system fitted to it. So that'll be interesting to see when Carl has a walk around next week. You'll be able to see all that shininess under there. We've still got a lot of welding and a lot of underside work to do on this car. But the car needs to be stripped before we can do that, and it's working out the sequence of events to enable us to put the car on the rotisserie after we've done all the other work and strip the running gear out, so that we can do all the underneath welding and any finishing off work underneath. But as I say, the exhaust part of that chain of events to get us to that stage where we can strip the running gear out without having to put it all back in again.